In the vast expanse of ancient Asia, where mountains touched the heavens and deserts stretched beyond mortal comprehension, a dream was born that would reshape the destiny of civilizations. It was the year 138 BCE, when Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty gazed westward from his palace in Chang'an, his heart heavy with the burden of protecting his empire from the fierce Xiongnu nomads who thundered across the northern steppes like wolves in winter. The emperor's court buzzed with whispers of distant lands beyond the Taklamakan desert, places where strange peoples dwelt and mysterious goods flowed like rivers of gold. It was then that fate delivered to his court a man whose name would echo through eternity, Zhang Qian, a court official whose courage burned brighter than the desert sun, and whose determination proved harder than the jade mountains of Kunlun. Zhang Qian knelt before the dragon throne, accepting a mission that seemed impossible to mortal men. He was to journey westward, beyond the edge of the known world, to forge an alliance with the Yuezhi people against their common enemy, the Xiongnu. Little did he know that his footsteps would carve the first permanent path along what would become humanity's greatest commercial artery. With 100 brave souls, Zhang Qian departed Chang'an. As autumn leaves fell like golden tears, the expedition moved through landscapes that tested the very limits of human endurance. They crossed the Hexi corridor, where ancient fortress cities stood, like sentinels against the endless sky, their walls bearing witness to countless caravans that would follow in centuries to come. But destiny had prepared trials that would forge legend from mere mortals. The Xiongnu captured Zhang Qian and his men, holding them prisoner for 10 years in the wind-swept steppes. Yet the flame of purpose burned eternal in Zhang Qian's heart. When opportunity finally smiled upon them, he escaped with a handful of loyal companions, continuing his westward journey with the persistence of flowing water that eventually carves through solid stone. The lands that unfolded before Zhang Qian's eyes were beyond the imagination of any Chinese before him. He encountered the kingdom of Dayan, where celestial horses galloped like thunder across emerald valleys, their speed and grace inspiring legends that would captivate Chinese hearts for generations. He witnessed the sophisticated civilization of Bactria, where Greek culture blended with local traditions in a magnificent tapestry of human achievement. In the markets of Samarkand and Bukhara, Zhang Qian beheld wonders that made his spirit soar. Merchants from distant Persia displayed carpets woven with patterns that seemed to capture the very essence of paradise. Indian traders offered spices that could transform the simplest meal into a feast worthy of emperors. Roman glass caught the desert light like captured stars, while Syrian silks flowed like liquid moonbeams through weathered hands. The ambassador realized that China's silk porcelain and tea were treasures beyond compare in these foreign lands, commanding prices that could finance entire kingdoms. The seeds of the greatest trade network in human history began to sprout in his visionary mind. He understood that the wealth of nations could flow along these treacherous paths, carrying not just goods, but ideas, technologies, and the very soul of civilizations. When Zhang Qian finally returned to Chang'an, 13 years after his departure, he brought with him more than reports of distant lands. He carried the blueprint for an empire's expansion, a vision of roads that would connect east and west in an embrace that would endure for centuries. Emperor Wu listened with growing amazement as his faithful servant described lands where grapes grew like pearls on the vine, where magnificent horses could carry Chinese armies to victory, and where the treasures of the world awaited Chinese merchants. The emperor's eyes blazed with imperial ambition as he contemplated the possibilities. Chinese silk could clothe Roman senators, while Chinese tea could refresh Persian nobles. In return, the wealth of the West would flow into Chinese coffers, strengthening the empire and expanding its influence to the very edges of the civilized world. Thus began the systematic expansion of Chinese influence westward. Military expeditions secured the Hexi Corridor, establishing the 4 great garrison towns that would anchor Chinese power in the western regions. Juquan, Zhangye, Wuwei, and Dunhuang rose like mighty pillars supporting the roof of empire, their walls protecting the merchants and pilgrims who would carry Chinese civilization to the ends of the earth. The establishment of the Protectorate of the Western regions marked the beginning of organized Chinese control over the transcontinental trade routes. Chinese generals and administrators established themselves in oasis cities along the rim of the Taklamakan Desert, creating a network of protection and support that would make long-distance trade not just possible but profitable beyond imagination. From the Jade Gates of Yumen, Chinese caravans began their epic journeys loaded with silk that shimmered like captured sunlight, porcelain that rang like temple bells, and tea that carried the essence of misty mountain mornings. These merchants were not merely traders, but pioneers of globalization, carrying Chinese culture and technology to lands where the names of Chinese emperors had never been whispered. The routes they followed became the arteries of a new world order, connecting civilizations separated by thousands of miles and seemingly insurmountable barriers. The northern route led through the oasis cities of Turpan and Kashgar, while the southern path wound through Khotan and Yarkand, each city becoming a crucial link in the chain that bound east to west. As the first century of the Common Era dawned upon the world, the pathways carved by Zhang Qian's courage had blossomed into rivers of commerce that flowed ceaselessly between the rising sun and the setting moon. The Han Dynasty, now secure in its western territories, witnessed the birth of something unprecedented in human history, a trade network so vast and complex that it would reshape the very foundations of civilization. The merchants who dared to traverse these perilous routes were men forged by adversity and tempered by ambition. They were not mere traders, but adventurers whose caravans stretched like serpents across the desert sands, laden with treasures that could purchase kingdoms. Chinese silk merchants, their faces weathered by desert winds and mountain storms, led expeditions of hundreds of camels through landscapes where death lurked behind every sand dune and bandits waited in every mountain pass. In the oasis city of Dunhuang, the last major Chinese settlement before the great desert caravans gathered like armies preparing for battle. The city's markets buzzed with languages from across the known world as merchants from China, Sogdiana, Persia, and India negotiated deals that would echo across continents. The famous caves of Mogao began to fill with Buddhist art as monks and pilgrims joined the commercial travelers, creating a spiritual dimension to the great trade route that would endure for centuries. The silk that departed from Chinese workshops was more than mere fabric. It was liquid luxury, light as whispered prayers, yet stronger than the bonds that held empires together. Chinese sericulture, guarded more jealously than state secrets, remained a mystery to Western lands, where silk commanded prices equivalent to gold. Roman senators draped themselves in these ethereal garments, never suspecting that their luxury originated from the patient labor of Chinese farmers who tended mulberry groves with devotion bordering on reverence. The westward flow of Chinese goods created a cultural tsunami that transformed every society it touched. Chinese porcelain, with its impossible combination of delicacy and durability, revolutionized dining customs from Persia to Rome. Tea, the elixir of Chinese philosophers and poets, began its conquest of Western palates, carrying with it the subtle wisdom of Chinese civilization. Paper, perhaps, China's greatest gift to humanity, began its slow journey westward, carrying the promise of literacy and learning to lands where knowledge had been the privilege of the few. Yet the Silk Road was never a one-way passage. As Chinese goods flowed westward, the treasures of distant lands poured into the Middle Kingdom, like tributaries feeding a mighty river. From the snow-capped peaks of Central Asia came the legendary heavenly horses that had so captivated Zhang Qian's imagination. These magnificent steeds, bred in the kingdom of Daiyuan, transformed Chinese military capabilities and inspired artistic traditions that would endure for millennia. Persian merchants, their caravans glittering with precious stones and aromatic spices, brought goods that dazzled Chinese courts and commoners alike. Saffron from the valleys of Kashmir colored Chinese cuisine with golden luxury, while frankincense from Arabian deserts perfumed Chinese temples with the essence of distant prayers. Glass-making techniques from Syrian workshops began to influence Chinese artisans, creating hybrid technologies that pushed the boundaries of human creativity. The great trading cities along the route grew fat with prosperity, their populations swelling as merchants, craftsmen, and service providers flocked to participate in this unprecedented economic boom. Samarkand emerged as the pearl of Central Asia, its markets a kaleidoscope of cultures, where Chinese silk merchants negotiated with Roman gold dealers, while Persian carpet weavers displayed their masterpieces to Indian spice traders. The city's architecture began to reflect this cultural fusion, with Chinese pagoda influences blending with Persian domes and Greek columns in structures that celebrated humanity's diversity. Kashgar, the great hub where the northern and southern routes around the Taklamakan Desert converged, became a cosmopolitan center that rivaled the greatest cities of the ancient world. Its Sunday market, a tradition that continues to this day, drew merchants from across Eurasia in a weekly celebration of commerce that transformed strangers into partners and competitors into friends. The city's rulers grew wealthy, taxing the endless stream of caravans, using their riches to build monuments that proclaimed their importance to all who passed through their domain. The security of these trade routes required constant vigilance and enormous investment. Chinese military garrisons dotted the landscape like islands of safety in an ocean of danger, their soldiers standing watch over the merchants who carried the empire's economic lifeblood. The cost of maintaining these outposts was enormous, but the rewards justified every copper coin spent. Taxes levied on passing caravans filled imperial treasuries, while the goods that reached Chinese markets enriched the lives of millions. The Kushan Empire, rising to power in the Hindu Kush Mountains and northern India, became a crucial intermediary in this grand exchange. Kushan rulers, wise enough to recognize the value of facilitating rather than hindering trade, established policies that protected merchants and standardized currencies across their realm. Their capital at Peshawar became a melting pot where Chinese pilgrims studying Buddhism mingled with Greek merchants selling wine and Roman agents purchasing exotic spices. Buddhism itself became one of the most significant exports along these routes, though it traveled in the opposite direction from most goods. Chinese pilgrims, inspired by the Buddha's teachings that had reached China through Central Asian missionaries, began their own epic journeys westward to study at the source of their faith. These religious travelers, often spending decades away from their homeland, created a parallel network of cultural exchange that enriched the commercial traffic with spiritual and intellectual cargo. The great pilgrim Zhang Qian, whose journey to India in the early 5th century would inspire countless others, exemplified the courage required to traverse these routes. His detailed records of the people's customs and dangers encountered along the way provide us with invaluable insights into the conditions that shaped early Silk Road travel. Through his eyes, we see a world where faith and commerce intertwined, where Buddhist monasteries served as hostels for traveling merchants, and where the pursuit of spiritual enlightenment followed the same paths as the quest for material profit. As the first centuries of Silk Road trade established their rhythms, certain patterns emerged that would characterize this network for over a millennium. The seasonal nature of travel, dictated by weather patterns, and the availability of water and fodder, created annual cycles of feast and famine in trading cities. Spring departures from Chinese cities coincided with the melting of mountain snows that made passes traversable, while autumn arrivals in Western markets aligned with harvest seasons that brought maximum purchasing power to agricultural societies. The 7th century arrived like a phoenix rising from the ashes of fallen dynasties, bringing with it an era that would witness the Silk Road reach heights of prosperity and cultural exchange never before imagined by mortal minds. The Tang dynasty, ascending to power in 618 CE, emerged as a colossus that would cast its shadow across the entire breadth of Eurasia, transforming the ancient trade routes into arteries of a truly global civilization. Emperor Taizong, whose vision encompassed lands beyond the sunrise and sunset, understood that China's destiny lay not in isolation, but in embracing the world's diversity. His capital, Chang'an, swelled to become the largest city on earth, home to over 1 million souls, drawn from every corner of the known world. The city's markets resembled a living museum of human civilization, where Persian fire worshippers prayed alongside Chinese Taoists, where Arab astronomers debated with Indian mathematicians, and where Central Asian dancers entertained Roman merchants beneath the same moon that had witnessed Zhang Qian's first footsteps into the unknown. The Tang military machine, with its combination of Chinese discipline and Central Asian cavalry tactics, swept across the western regions like an unstoppable tide. The Battle of Talas in 751 CE would mark the westernmost extent of Chinese power, but by then, Chinese influence had already transformed every aspect of Silk Road commerce and culture. Tang garrisons stretched from the Jade Gates of China to the borders of the Islamic world, creating a security umbrella under which trade flourished as never before. Under Tang protection, the great trading cities reached their zenith of wealth and sophistication. Turf nestled in its depression below sea level, became a paradise of vineyards and cotton fields that supplied the needs of countless caravans. Its Buddhist cave temples, carved into the flaming cliffs of the Bezeklek Valley, housed treasures that rivaled those of Chang'an itself. Merchants from every nation sought the blessing of Buddha before embarking on their perilous journeys, creating a spiritual bond that transcended commercial competition. Samarkand, under the rule of the Sogdian princes, evolved into the undisputed queen of Central Asian commerce. The Sogdians themselves had become the master merchants of the age, their language serving as the lingua franca of international trade from the Yellow River to the Mediterranean Sea. These remarkable people, neither fully Chinese nor Persian nor Turkish, created a mercantile culture that bridged every gap between civilizations. Their letters preserved in the sands of time reveal commercial networks of staggering complexity, with partnerships spanning continents and credit arrangements that would impress modern bankers. The goods that flowed along these routes during the Tang Golden Age represented the pinnacle of human craftsmanship and creativity. Chinese silk had evolved from simple luxury to high art, with patterns that told stories of dragons dancing with phoenixes, of lotus flowers blooming in paradise, of scholars contemplating the mysteries of existence. Tang potters had perfected the art of three-color glazing, creating ceramics that captured the very essence of earthly beauty while suggesting heavenly perfection. From the workshops of Damascus came steel that could cut through anything, yet bend, without breaking its secrets so closely guarded that even today modern metallurgists struggle to replicate the techniques of these ancient masters. Persian carpets had achieved such perfection that they seemed to contain entire universes within their woven patterns, each thread a prayer, each knot a meditation on the divine geometry that underlies all creation. The westward flow of Chinese inventions during this period would reshape human civilization in ways that still echo through modern times. Papermaking, that most democratic of technologies, began its slow conquest of the world, carrying with it the promise that knowledge could be preserved and shared rather than hoarded by priestly elites. The magnetic compass, born from Chinese observations of lodestone behavior, would eventually guide European explorers to new continents, though that destiny lay centuries in the future. Chinese medical knowledge, refined through millennia of careful observation and philosophical reflection, began to influence healing practices across Eurasia. Acupuncture techniques spread westward, along with Chinese herbalism, creating hybrid medical traditions that drew from multiple healing systems. Persian physicians began incorporating Chinese diagnostic methods, while Indian doctors experimented with Chinese pharmaceutical preparations, creating a truly international approach to human health. The Tang period also witnessed the full flowering of religious and philosophical exchange along the Silk Road. Buddhism, having already established itself in China, began its transformation into distinctly Chinese forms that would eventually spread to Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia. The Great Pilgrimage of Xuanzang to India, lasting from 629 to 645 CE, exemplified the religious devotion that motivated thousands of Chinese to undertake the perilous journey westward in search of authentic Buddhist teachings. Xuanzang's journey surpassed even Zhang Qian's epic in terms of distances covered and obstacles overcome. Traveling against imperial orders, the young monk crossed the Gobi Desert in secret, endured the bitter cold of mountain passes, where the bones of previous travelers marked the path, and survived encounters with bandits who saw pilgrims as easy prey. His detailed records of the lands he visited provide us with invaluable snapshots of 7th century Central and South Asia, revealing a world of thriving Buddhist monasteries, sophisticated urban centers, and complex political arrangements. When Xuanzang finally returned to Chang'an, he brought with him over 600 Buddhist texts, numerous sacred relics and experiences that would inspire the great Chinese novel, Journey to the West. More importantly, his translations of Sanskrit texts into Chinese created a philosophical bridge between Indian and Chinese thought that would influence both civilizations for centuries to come. The cosmopolitan nature of Tang society was perhaps most visible in its capital's foreign quarter, where merchants and diplomats from across the known world established permanent communities. Persian Zoroastrians built fire temples where eternal flames honored Ahura Mazda, while Chinese converts to the faith learned to see the cosmic struggle between light and darkness through Persian eyes. Nestorian Christians, carrying a version of Christianity that had been shaped by Persian and Central Asian influences, established churches that would survive in China for centuries. Arab merchants, representing the rising power of Islam, began appearing in Chinese markets during the later Tang period, bringing with them not only goods, but also mathematical and astronomical knowledge that would enrich Chinese science. The Arabic numeral system itself, borrowed from Indian mathematicians, began its slow integration into Chinese calculation methods, while Chinese papermaking techniques traveled westward to eventually reach the Islamic world, and through it, medieval Europe. The sophistication of Tang-era trade arrangements astounded even contemporary observers. Letters of credit issued by Sogdian banking houses in Samarkand were honored in Chang'an, while Chinese merchants could deposit silk in Dunhuang and withdraw its equivalent value in gold from partners in Constantinople. The standardization of weights, measures, and currencies across vast distances required diplomatic agreements between multiple kingdoms and empires, creating the world's first truly international commercial law. Exchange rates between different regional currencies were carefully monitored and adjusted, with professional money changers operating in every major trading center. The famous flying money system, developed by Chinese merchants during this period, allowed traders to avoid carrying heavy coins across dangerous territories, instead relying on letters of credit that could be redeemed at distant locations. This innovation would eventually inspire similar systems in medieval Europe and the Islamic world. The cultural synthesis that occurred during the Tang Golden Age created art forms that had never before existed in human history. Chinese potters began incorporating Persian and Central Asian motifs into their designs, while maintaining distinctly Chinese aesthetic principles. The result was a ceramic tradition that spoke multiple cultural languages, simultaneously appealing to Chinese scholars, Persian nobles, and Arab merchants with equal effectiveness. The 8th and 9th centuries witnessed the Silk Road evolve into something far greater than a mere commercial network. It became the nervous system of human civilization, pulsing with the lifeblood of cultural exchange that would forever alter the trajectory of human development. As the Tang dynasty reached its cultural zenith, the trade routes carried not merely goods, but the very essence of human creativity, transforming every society they touched into participants in humanity's greatest collaborative masterpiece. The city of Kashgar, standing at the crossroads where empires met and cultures merged, embodied this transformation more dramatically than any other settlement along the route. Its bazaars had evolved into universities of practical wisdom, where merchants from Rome learned Persian accounting methods, where Chinese engineers studied hydraulic techniques perfected in the oases of Central Asia, and where Arab mathematicians discovered geometric principles that Chinese artists had embedded in their silk patterns for centuries. The Great Mosque of Kashgar, its architecture blending Chinese pagoda principles with Islamic geometric perfection, served as a symbol of the cultural synthesis that defined this golden age. Within its walls, Muslim merchants from Baghdad prayed alongside Chinese Muslim converts whose ancestors had embraced Islam through Sogdian intermediaries, creating a spiritual community that transcended ethnic and linguistic boundaries while maintaining the distinct flavor of each contributing tradition. The sophistication of manufacturing during this period reflected the cross-pollination of techniques and aesthetics that the Silk Road had made possible. Chinese craftsmen had learned to work with Persian silver inlay techniques, creating metalwork that combined Chinese dragons with Persian floral motifs in patterns that spoke to souls shaped by both traditions. Persian carpet weavers incorporated Chinese cloud patterns into their designs while maintaining the mathematical precision that characterized Persian decorative arts. Glassmaking. Once the exclusive domain of Syrian and Egyptian workshops had spread eastward along the trade routes, with Chinese artisans developing their own variations that incorporated traditional Chinese aesthetic principles. The result was glassware that captured light in uniquely Chinese ways, while maintaining the technical excellence that had made Mediterranean glass famous throughout the ancient world. The intellectual exchange that accompanied commercial trade during this period laid the foundations for advances that would benefit all humanity. Chinese alchemists, in their eternal quest for the elixir of immortality, had discovered techniques for creating explosive powders that would eventually revolutionize warfare and mining. These secrets began their slow journey westward through Central Asian intermediaries who understood their potential applications in both military and civilian contexts. Persian and Arab astronomers, building upon Indian mathematical foundations, had developed increasingly sophisticated methods for calculating celestial movements and predicting eclipses. When these techniques reached China through the medium of Sogdian scholars, they merged with Chinese observational traditions to create hybrid astronomical systems that were more accurate than either tradition alone could achieve. The medical knowledge that flowed along these routes created healing traditions that drew from the wisdom of every major civilization. Chinese physicians studying in Samarkand learned Persian diagnostic techniques, while Persian doctors visiting Chang'an discovered Chinese approaches to understanding the body's energy systems. Indian Ayurvedic practitioners traveling the routes shared their knowledge of herbal remedies while learning from local healing traditions in every region they visited. The culinary revolution that accompanied this cultural exchange transformed dining customs across Eurasia in ways that still influence modern cuisines. Chinese cooks learned to use Central Asian spices that had originated in Indian mountain valleys, creating flavor combinations that would define Chinese cuisine for centuries to come. Persian chefs discovered Chinese techniques for preserving and preparing vegetables, while Arab merchants introduced new cooking methods that had developed in the kitchens of Baghdad and Damascus. China's great gift to the world's palate began its conquest of Central Asian and Persian societies during this period. The ritual of tea drinking, with its emphasis on contemplation and social bonding, found fertile ground among Sufi mystics, who recognized in tea ceremony a perfect complement to their spiritual practices. Persian poets began composing verses that celebrated tea's ability to inspire wisdom and foster friendship among strangers. The textile revolution that had begun with Chinese silk exports now encompassed techniques and materials from across the known world. Sogdian merchants had become masters of international fashion, commissioning textiles that incorporated Chinese silk, Persian gold thread, Indian cotton, and Central Asian wool into garments that could appeal to customers from Constantinople to Beijing. These hybrid textiles often told stories that spanned cultures, with Chinese dragons dancing alongside Persian lions, while Islamic geometric patterns provided background harmony. The standardization of currencies and trading practices that had begun during the early Tang period reached new levels of sophistication as the volume of trade continued to expand. Banking houses in Samarkand could now guarantee payment in Damascus for goods purchased in Turfan, while merchants in Kashgar could obtain credit based on silk inventories stored in Chang'an. These financial innovations required unprecedented levels of trust and cooperation between different cultural and political systems. The security arrangements that protected this vast commercial network had evolved into complex diplomatic agreements that involved dozens of kingdoms and city-states. The Tibetan Empire, rising to power in the southern Himalayas, became both a participant in Silk Road trade and a guarantor of safe passage for merchants traveling alternative routes that bypassed traditional choke points. Their capital at Lhasa began attracting merchants and pilgrims from across Asia, creating another node in the ever-expanding network of cultural exchange. Chinese diplomatic missions during this period were marvels of cultural adaptation and political sophistication. Chinese ambassadors to Persian courts learned to navigate complex protocols while maintaining their essential Chinese identity. Persian envoys to Chang'an mastered Chinese etiquette while preserving their own cultural dignity. These diplomatic exchanges created personal relationships between rulers separated by thousands of miles, fostering the trust necessary for large-scale commercial cooperation. The artistic traditions that emerged from this cultural mixing were unprecedented in human history. Chinese painters began incorporating perspective techniques learned from Persian miniaturists, while Persian artists discovered Chinese approaches to capturing the essence of natural phenomena rather than their mere appearance. Sculpture traditions that had developed independently in China, Gandhara, and Persia began influencing each other, creating hybrid styles that could speak to audiences shaped by multiple aesthetic traditions. Music and dance underwent similar transformations as instruments, melodies, and performance styles traveled the trade routes alongside commercial goods. Chinese courts welcomed Central Asian musicians whose instruments and techniques enriched Chinese musical traditions, while Chinese musical innovations spread westward to influence Persian and Arab compositions. The famous Tang dynasty preference for foreign music and dance reflected the dynasty's confidence in its own cultural strength and its openness to global influences. The religious landscape of Eurasia was being fundamentally redrawn by the constant flow of pilgrims, missionaries, and converts along the Silk Road. Buddhism continued its transformation as it moved between cultures, developing distinct regional characteristics while maintaining its essential spiritual message. Chinese Buddhism began developing features that would distinguish it from its Indian origins, while Central Asian Buddhist communities created their own interpretations that reflected their unique cultural circumstances. Christianity, in its Nestorian form, had established permanent communities throughout Central Asia and even reached China itself, where the famous Nestorian stele records the arrival and acceptance of Christian teachings in the Tang capital. These Christian communities often served as intermediaries in commercial transactions, their shared faith creating bonds of trust that transcended cultural and linguistic barriers. The 10th century dawned upon a world transformed, yet trembling, as the mighty Tang dynasty, that colossus which had bestride the Silk Road like a benevolent titan, began to show the first hairline cracks that would eventually shatter the foundations of the old order. The Anlushan Rebellion, that devastating civil war which had torn through the heart of Chinese civilization like a sword through silk, had weakened the empire's grip on its western territories, creating opportunities for new powers to rise and reshape the ancient trade routes according to their own visions and ambitions. The withdrawal of Chinese garrisons from the furthest western outposts marked not the end of the Silk Road, but rather its metamorphosis into something entirely new and perhaps even more remarkable than what had come before. As Chinese military protection diminished, local rulers and emerging powers stepped forward to fill the vacuum, each bringing their own cultural perspectives and administrative systems to bear on the challenge of maintaining this vital commercial lifeline. The rise of Islamic power across Central Asia represented one of the most dramatic transformations in Silk Road history, as Arab conquerors and their Persian allies swept across territories that had known Chinese influence for centuries. Yet these new masters of the trade routes proved themselves to be not destroyers, but inheritors and improvers of the commercial systems they encountered. The Islamic concept of the Ummah, the community of believers that transcended ethnic and tribal boundaries, created new possibilities for commercial cooperation across vast distances. The Abbasid Caliphate, with its capital in Baghdad, emerged as a commercial powerhouse that rivaled even the Tang dynasty at its zenith. The caliph's court became a magnet for merchants, scholars, and artists from across the known world, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that facilitated trade and cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale. The famous House of Wisdom in Baghdad became a crucible where Greek philosophy, Persian science, Indian mathematics, and Chinese technology merged to create new forms of knowledge that would benefit all humanity. Under Islamic rule, the ancient cities along the Silk Road experienced a renaissance that in many cases surpassed their earlier prosperity. Bukhara, now under Samanid control, became renowned throughout the Islamic world for its scholarship and commerce. Its markets filled with goods from China to Iberia, while its libraries housed manuscripts that preserved the wisdom of antiquity and fostered new discoveries. The city's architecture began to reflect this new Islamic identity while maintaining elements that spoke to its diverse commercial heritage. Samarkand, that eternal queen of Central Asian cities, adapted to Islamic rule with the flexibility that had always characterized successful Silk Road communities. The Sogdian merchants, who had dominated international trade for centuries, gradually converted to Islam while maintaining their commercial networks and expertise. Their conversion was not merely a matter of religious conviction, but a practical recognition that the new faith offered opportunities for expanded trade relationships across the growing Islamic world. The Ghaznavid Empire, rising to power in what is now Afghanistan, created a bridge between the Islamic world and the Indian subcontinent that would prove crucial for Silk Road commerce. Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni, though remembered primarily for his military campaigns, was also a patron of trade, who understood that commercial prosperity was the foundation of political power. Under his rule, the passes through the Hindu Kush became highways for merchants carrying Chinese goods to Indian markets and Indian treasures to Central Asian trading centers. The transformation of religious and cultural life along the Silk Road during this period was as dramatic as the political changes that accompanied it. Buddhism, which had flourished under Chinese protection, found itself adapting to new circumstances as Islamic rulers gradually replaced Chinese administrators. Some Buddhist communities converted to Islam, while others maintained their faith under the protection of tolerant Muslim rulers who recognized the commercial value of religious diversity. The great Buddhist cave complexes at Dunhuang Bezeklik and other sites along the route began to decline as patronage shifted toward Islamic institutions, yet they remained important repositories of cultural memory and continued to serve travelers of all faiths. The coexistence of different religious communities created a unique form of multiculturalism that would influence art, architecture, and social customs throughout Central Asia. The technological innovations that continued to flow along the Silk Road during this period of political transition demonstrated the resilience of commercial and cultural exchange in the face of changing political circumstances. Chinese papermaking techniques, which had begun their westward journey during the Tang period, reached the Islamic world, where they were enthusiastically adopted and improved upon. The Battle of Talas in 751 CE, often remembered for marking the limit of Chinese expansion, also resulted in the capture of Chinese papermakers, whose techniques would revolutionize Islamic administration and scholarship. The Islamic world's adoption of paper technology created a revolution in learning and record-keeping that would have profound implications for Silk Road commerce. Administrative efficiency improved dramatically as Islamic rulers could now maintain detailed records of trade transactions, tax collections, and diplomatic correspondence. The mass production of books became possible, democratizing knowledge and facilitating the spread of commercial and technical information across the Islamic world. Chinese printing technology, though slower to travel westward than papermaking, began to influence Islamic bookmaking during this period. While the Islamic world would not fully adopt printing until much later, the concept of mechanical reproduction of texts began to circulate among scholars and administrators who recognized its potential applications. This technological transfer demonstrated the continuing flow of Chinese innovations westward, even as Chinese political control diminished. The monetary systems that had developed during the Tang Golden Age evolved to accommodate the new political realities while maintaining the international character that made long-distance trade possible. Islamic gold dinars and silver dirhams began to circulate alongside Chinese coins and local currencies, creating complex exchange systems that required sophisticated mathematical skills to navigate effectively. Jewish and Christian merchant communities often served as intermediaries in these transactions, their presence tolerated or even encouraged by Islamic rulers who valued their commercial expertise. The emergence of powerful trading families during this period created commercial dynasties that would influence Silk Road trade for centuries. These merchant princes often accumulated wealth that rivaled that of kings, using their resources to establish networks that spanned continents. The Radhanite merchants, a Jewish trading network that connected Europe with China via Central Asian routes, exemplified the international character of commerce during this era. Persian and Arab geographers during this period produced maps and travel guides that demonstrated unprecedented knowledge of Eurasian geography and commercial conditions. The works of scholars like al-Masudi and Ibn Hawqal provided detailed descriptions of trade routes, local customs, and commercial opportunities that served as invaluable resources for merchants planning long-distance expeditions. These geographical treatises represented a new form of literature that combined practical commercial information with scholarly investigation of the wider world. The agricultural innovations that spread along the Silk Road during this period included new crops and farming techniques that would transform societies across Eurasia. Islamic agricultural science, building upon Roman, Persian, and Indian foundations, developed new methods of irrigation and crop rotation that supported larger populations and generated greater agricultural surpluses for trade. These innovations were particularly important in the oasis cities of Central Asia, where water management was literally a matter of life and death. The introduction of new crops along the trade routes created agricultural revolutions that supported population growth and commercial expansion. Sugar cultivation, originally developed in India, spread westward through Persian intermediaries, while new varieties of fruits and vegetables traveled in both directions along the routes. The famous Silk Road gardens of Central Asian cities became showcases for international horticulture as rulers competed to display the most exotic plants from the most distant lands. Urban planning and architecture along the Silk Road began to reflect the new Islamic cultural synthesis, while maintaining practical features that had developed over centuries of commercial use. The great madrasas and mosques that rose in trading cities served not only religious functions, but also provided accommodation and meeting places for traveling merchants. The architectural fusion that resulted combined Islamic geometric principles with local building traditions and practical commercial requirements. The 11th and 12th centuries witnessed the emergence of new powers that would reshape the Silk Road into configurations unimaginable to the ancient Chinese emperors, who had first dreamed of connecting east and west through courage and commerce. The Seljuk Turks, sweeping out of the Central Asian steppes like a whirlwind of ambition and faith, established an empire that stretched from the borders of China to the gates of Constantinople, creating the largest unified control over Silk Road territories since the height of Tang power. Under Seljuk rule, the ancient trade routes experienced a renaissance that combined nomadic efficiency with settled commercial sophistication. The Seljuk sultans, understanding that their empire's strength lay not in suppressing trade, but in facilitating it, invested heavily in infrastructure that would make their territories the preferred corridor for international commerce. The great Sultan Alp Arslan and his successors constructed caravanserais at regular intervals along the major routes, creating a network of fortified hostels that provided security supplies and services for traveling merchants. These caravanserais represented architectural marvels that perfectly embodied the Seljuk approach to Silk Road management. Built like fortresses, yet designed like palaces, they offered merchants not merely shelter, but luxury accommodations that made the hardships of long-distance travel bearable. The greatest of these establishments could house thousands of travelers simultaneously, with separate quarters for merchants of different faiths and ethnicities, stables for thousands of animals, and workshops where goods could be repaired or modified to suit local tastes. The Seljuk legal system, based on Islamic law but adapted to the practical needs of international commerce, created a framework for dispute resolution that transcended cultural and religious boundaries. Merchants who had traveled from Buddhist China through Christian Armenia to Islamic Persia could expect consistent treatment under Seljuk commercial law regardless of their personal faith or ethnic origin. This legal predictability was worth its weight in gold to traders whose success depended on calculating risks across vast distances and diverse jurisdictions. The rise of the Khwarezmian Empire in the early 13th century marked another transformation in Silk Road dynamics as a new power emerged to challenge Seljuk dominance over Central Asian trade. The Khwarezm Shahs, ruling from their capital at Urgench, created a commercial empire that rivaled the greatest trading powers of antiquity. Under their rule, the ancient cities of Merv, Nishapur, and Herat reached new heights of prosperity as goods flowed through their territories in unprecedented volumes. The Khwarezmian approach to Silk Road management emphasized efficiency and standardization over the more decentralized Seljuk model. Ala ad-Din Atsiz and his successors established uniform weights, measures, and currencies across their territories, while maintaining detailed records of commercial transactions that allowed for sophisticated analysis of trade patterns and tax optimization. Their administrative system became a model that would influence commercial practices throughout the Islamic world. Yet even as new Islamic powers consolidated control over the central portions of the Silk Road, the extremities of the network continued to evolve according to their own unique circumstances. In China, the Song dynasty had adopted a more inward-looking approach than their Tang predecessors, yet they maintained active commercial relationships with Central Asian partners through carefully controlled border markets and diplomatic missions. The Song innovation of paper money revolutionized commercial transactions within China and began to influence trading practices along the frontier regions where Chinese merchants interacted with Central Asian partners. This monetary innovation, combined with sophisticated credit systems and commercial law, made Chinese markets increasingly attractive to foreign traders, even as direct Chinese political control over Silk Road territories diminished. The maritime trade routes that the Song dynasty promoted as alternatives to overland Silk Road connections created new competitive pressures that forced land-based trading networks to improve their efficiency and reduce their costs. The famous Chinese admiral Zheng He's voyages in the early 15th century would later demonstrate the potential of sea-based trade to bypass traditional Silk Road routes entirely, though that development lay centuries in the future. In the western terminus of the Silk Road network, the Byzantine Empire struggled to maintain its role as the bridge between Asian trade and European markets, while facing increasing pressure from Seljuk expansion and the rising commercial power of Italian city-states. Constantinople remained a crucial hub, where goods from China, India, and Central Asia were distributed to European customers, but Byzantine merchants faced growing competition from Venetian and Genoese traders who offered more efficient services and better financing. The Crusades, beginning in the late 11th century, created new complications and opportunities for Silk Road trade as European military expeditions brought Western merchants into direct contact with Middle Eastern and Central Asian commercial networks. Crusader states in the Levant became important intermediaries in international trade, with European knights often proving surprisingly adept at commercial negotiation despite their supposed dedication to purely military and religious objectives. The technological exchanges that continued to flow along the Silk Road during this period included innovations that would eventually transform warfare, agriculture, and industry across Eurasia. Chinese gunpowder technology, having slowly migrated westward through Central Asian intermediaries, began to appear in Islamic military applications by the 12th century. The gradual spread of this technology would eventually revolutionize military tactics and fortress design across the entire Eurasian landmass. Agricultural innovations continued to transform societies along the trade routes as new crops, farming techniques, and irrigation methods spread between civilizations. The three-field system of agriculture, developing in medieval Europe, began to influence farming practices in Western Asia through commercial contacts, while Islamic agricultural sciences continued to spread eastward through scholarly and commercial exchange. The intellectual ferment that characterized this period of Silk Road history produced some of humanity's greatest philosophical and scientific achievements. Islamic scholars, working with texts and ideas gathered from across the known world, made fundamental contributions to mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy that would influence human thought for centuries to come. The translation movement that had begun during the Abbasid Golden Age continued to bear fruit as scholars working in Silk Road cities served as intermediaries between Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese intellectual traditions. The great philosopher and physician Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, exemplified the cosmopolitan intellectual culture that flourished in Silk Road cities during this period. His medical encyclopedia, drawing upon Greek, Persian, and Islamic sources, while incorporating observations from his own extensive travels, became the standard medical text throughout both the Islamic world and medieval Europe. His philosophical works, similarly synthetic in their approach, demonstrated the intellectual possibilities that emerged when different wisdom traditions encountered each other in the cosmopolitan atmosphere of international trade centers. The artistic traditions that developed during this period reflected the continuing cultural synthesis that characterized Silk Road civilization. Persian miniature painting, incorporating influences from Chinese landscape techniques and Byzantine icon traditions, created a distinctive aesthetic that would influence artistic development across the Islamic world. Islamic calligraphy, elevated to new heights of sophistication, began to incorporate decorative elements drawn from the artistic traditions of all the cultures that participated in Silk Road trade. The musical traditions that emerged from this cultural mixing created new forms of expression that drew upon the rhythmic patterns of Central Asian nomads, the melodic sophistication of Persian court music, and the harmonic principles that had developed in Chinese musical theory. These hybrid musical forms would eventually influence artistic development from Spain to Southeast Asia as they spread along both land and sea trade routes. The merchant communities that dominated Silk Road trade during this period developed into sophisticated international networks that transcended political and religious boundaries. Armenian merchants, leveraging their Christian identity and commercial expertise, created trading networks that connected European markets with Central Asian suppliers. Jewish merchants, building upon traditions that dated back to antiquity, maintained commercial relationships that spanned the entire breadth of the known world. The 13th century erupted across the steppes of Asia like thunder from a clear sky, as a force unlike any the world had ever witnessed came thundering out of the Mongolian highlands to reshape the destiny of nations and transform the Silk Road into something that even its ancient architects could never have imagined. Temujin, who would become known to history as Genghis Khan, united the fractured tribes of Mongolia not merely through conquest, but through a vision that encompassed the entire civilized world beneath a single rule, a single law, and a single vast network of commerce that would make the ancient Silk Road seem like a mere village path in comparison. The Mongol conquest of Central Asia, swift and devastating, as a prairie fire swept away the Khwarezmian Empire in a campaign that demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of nomadic warfare applied with unprecedented strategic vision. The great cities of Bukhara, Samarkand, and Merv, which had grown fat with centuries of commercial prosperity, fell before the Mongol onslaught like wheat before the scythe, their populations scattered, and their treasures claimed for the growing Mongol war machine. Yet what emerged from this apparent destruction was not the end of Silk Road civilization, but its greatest flowering as the Mongols proved themselves to be not merely conquerors, but the most effective facilitators of international trade that the world had ever seen. Genghis Khan's genius lay not only in his military innovations, but in his recognition that lasting power came not from destroying commercial networks, but from controlling and expanding them to serve the needs of his growing empire. The Pax Mongolica that emerged from the initial conquest created conditions for trade that surpassed even the golden age of Tang Dynasty control over the Silk Road. Under Mongol rule, a merchant could travel from Venice to Beijing with a single passport, carrying goods worth a king's ransom, while enjoying the protection of the most formidable military force in human history. The famous boast that a virgin carrying gold could travel safely from one end of the Mongol Empire to the other was not mere propaganda, but a reflection of the security that Mongol law and Mongol arms provided to all who submitted to the Great Khan's authority. The Mongol postal system, known as the Yam, represented perhaps the most sophisticated communication network that had ever existed, with relay stations positioned at regular intervals across the entire breadth of Eurasia. This system, originally designed to serve military and administrative needs, became the backbone of commercial communication that allowed merchants separated by thousands of miles to coordinate their activities with unprecedented precision and speed. Under Ogedei Khan, Genghis Khan's successor, the Mongol Empire reached its administrative zenith as the conquered territories were organized into a coherent governmental system that balanced nomadic traditions with the practical needs of ruling settled populations. The capital at Karakoram became a magnet for merchants, craftsmen, and scholars from across the known world, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that rivaled the greatest cities of antiquity. The religious tolerance that characterized Mongol rule created unprecedented opportunities for cultural and commercial exchange as Christians. Muslims, Buddhists, and traditional shamanists worked together in the service of the Great Khan. This religious pluralism, born from nomadic pragmatism rather than philosophical conviction, created an environment where commercial relationships could transcend the religious boundaries that had sometimes hindered trade in earlier periods. The division of the Mongol Empire into separate khanates, following Möngke Khan's death in 1259, might have seemed to threaten the unity that had made Pax Mongolica possible. Yet the four successor states, the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, maintained cooperative relationships that preserved the essential character of the Mongol trading system. Kublai Khan's establishment of the Yuan dynasty in China represented the culmination of centuries of Chinese engagement with the Silk Road. As for the first time in history, the Middle Kingdom was ruled by a dynasty that had conquered the entire breadth of the Eurasian trade network. Under Yuan rule, China became more cosmopolitan and internationally engaged than at any previous period in its history, with foreign merchants enjoying privileges and opportunities that would have been unthinkable under previous Chinese dynasties. The famous travels of Marco Polo during this period epitomized the new possibilities for international travel and commerce that the Mongol Empire had created. The young Venetian's journey to Kublai Khan's court, lasting over 2 decades, demonstrated that Europeans could now participate directly in Asian trade, rather than relying on Middle Eastern intermediaries. Polo's detailed accounts of Chinese technology customs and commercial practices would inspire European interest in Asian markets for centuries to come. The technological transfers that accelerated under Mongol rule included innovations that would transform human civilization in ways that are still felt today. Chinese printing technology, gunpowder formulations, and navigational instruments spread westward through Mongol territories with unprecedented speed, while Islamic astronomical knowledge and Persian administrative techniques moved eastward to enrich Chinese science and governance. The Mongol Empire's approach to managing paper currency represented a revolutionary development in international finance that would influence monetary systems across Eurasia. The Yuan dynasty's sophisticated paper money system, backed by silver reserves and imperial authority, created possibilities for large-scale commercial transactions that would have been impossible using traditional metallic currencies alone. The agricultural innovations that spread throughout the Mongol Empire included new crops and farming techniques that supported population growth and commercial expansion across the vast territories under Mongol control. The systematic introduction of crops from different climate zones created agricultural diversity that reduced the risk of famine while generating surpluses that supported non-agricultural populations engaged in craft production and trade. The urban planning that characterized Mongol-era cities reflected the empire's commitment to facilitating international commerce while maintaining the security that made long-distance trade possible. The reconstruction of destroyed cities like Samarkand and Bukhara incorporated defensive features with commercial infrastructure, creating urban environments that could serve both as military strongholds and as thriving commercial centers. The legal innovations that the Mongols introduced to manage their vast territories included commercial law that transcended cultural and religious boundaries while providing consistent standards for dispute resolution. The great Yasa Genghis Khan's legal code established principles that applied equally to all subjects, regardless of their ethnic or religious background, creating predictability that was essential for long-distance commercial relationships. The diplomatic protocols that emerged during the height of Mongol power established precedents for international relations that would influence interstate relationships for centuries to come. The Mongol system of diplomatic immunity, standardized ceremonial procedures, and multilingual communication created frameworks for peaceful interaction between different political and cultural systems. The maritime connections that developed during the Mongol period linked the land-based Silk Road with sea routes that connected China with Southeast Asia, India, and the Persian Gulf. This integration of land and sea routes created redundancy and flexibility in international trade networks, while opening new markets and sources of supply that enriched the entire system. The intellectual synthesis that occurred during the Mongol period brought together scholarly traditions from across Eurasia in ways that had never before been possible. Chinese scholars working in Persian observatories, Islamic mathematicians serving in Chinese courts, and European craftsmen sharing techniques with Central Asian artisans created an intellectual ferment that advanced human knowledge in every field of inquiry. The artistic achievements of the Mongol period reflected the cosmopolitan character of the empire while maintaining distinctive regional characteristics that celebrated local traditions within the broader imperial framework. Persian miniatures from this period show Chinese influences. Chinese porcelain incorporated Islamic decorative motifs, and Central Asian textiles combined techniques and patterns from across the known world. As the 14th century dawned upon a world transformed by Mongol conquest and administration, the vast empire that had stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna began to fragment along the fault lines of geography, culture, and competing ambitions. Yet the commercial networks that the Mongols had perfected continued to flourish even as political unity dissolved into rivalry between the successor khanates. The genius of the Mongol system lay not merely in its military efficiency, but in its creation of institutions and practices that could survive the empire's political fragmentation while continuing to serve the needs of international commerce. The Ilkhanate of Persia, under rulers like Ghazan Khan, who converted to Islam, while maintaining the Mongol commitment to religious tolerance and commercial facilitation, demonstrated how Mongol administrative practices could adapt to local conditions while preserving the essential features that made long-distance trade profitable and secure. The great cities of Tabriz, Isfahan, and Shiraz experienced a renaissance under Ilkhanid rule as Persian artisans combined traditional techniques with innovations learned from Chinese craftsmen who had been relocated to Persian workshops during the height of Mongol unity. The Yuan dynasty in China, though eventually overthrown by the Ming in 1368, left an indelible mark on Chinese civilization through its promotion of international trade and cultural exchange. The Chinese technological innovations that spread throughout the Mongol Empire during this period, including advanced metallurgy, sophisticated mechanical devices, and revolutionary printing techniques, created a technological revolution that would eventually reach Europe and transform human civilization in ways that are still unfolding today. The paper money system that reached its highest development under Kublai Khan represented a monetary revolution that would influence economic thinking across Eurasia for centuries to come. The Yuan government's ability to maintain the value of paper currency through careful management of the money supply and backing by precious metal reserves demonstrated possibilities for monetary policy that would not be fully understood or implemented in Europe until the modern era. The maritime expeditions that connected the Yuan dynasty with Southeast Asian kingdoms and Indian Ocean trading networks created an integrated system of land and sea routes that maximized the efficiency of international commerce while providing alternative pathways that reduced the vulnerability of trade to political disruption or natural disasters. Chinese naval technology during this period, including the magnetic compass, watertight compartments, and advanced sail configurations, gave Chinese merchants significant advantages in oceanic trade. The Golden Horde's control over the Northern Silk Road, routes through Russian territories, created new pathways for European participation in Asian trade, while maintaining the security and administrative efficiency that characterized Mongol commercial management. Under rulers like Beg Khan, the Golden Horde became increasingly Islamic in character, while preserving the religious tolerance and commercial pragmatism that had made Mongol rule acceptable to diverse populations. The Chagatai Khanate, controlling the heartland of Central Asia, remained the crucial intermediary between the eastern and western portions of the former Mongol Empire, even as political unity dissolved. The great trading cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar continued to flourish under Chagatai rule, as merchants from all corners of Eurasia gathered in their bazaars to exchange goods, ideas, and cultural practices. The rise of Tamerlane in the late 14th century represented both a continuation and a transformation of the Mongol legacy, as this Turkic Mongol conqueror sought to restore the unity and grandeur of Genghis Khan's empire while adapting Mongol military and administrative practices to the changed circumstances of his era. Tamerlane's capital at Samarkand became perhaps the most magnificent city in the world. Its architecture combining Islamic, Persian, and Central Asian traditions in monuments that celebrated both military conquest and commercial prosperity. The Timurid Empire that emerged from Tamerlane's conquests created a final golden age for the overland Silk Road, as Timurid rulers invested heavily in the infrastructure and security arrangements that made long-distance trade profitable while patronizing the arts and sciences that flourished in cosmopolitan trading centers. The astronomical observatory at Samarkand, built by Ulugh Beg, represented the culmination of centuries of scientific exchange along the Silk Road as scholars from across Eurasia collaborated in advancing human understanding of the cosmos. The technological synthesis that reached its peak during the Timurid period included innovations that combined Chinese mechanical expertise with Islamic mathematical precision and Persian aesthetic sensibility. The famous mechanical clocks and astronomical instruments produced in Samarkand workshops during this period represented the highest achievements of pre-modern technology, incorporating knowledge and techniques that had been gathered from across the civilized world. The artistic renaissance that flourished under Timurid patronage created masterpieces that synthesized the aesthetic traditions of all the cultures that had participated in Silk Road exchange. Persian miniature painting reached new heights of sophistication while incorporating influences from Chinese landscape traditions and Byzantine icon painting. The illuminated manuscripts produced in Timurid workshops combined Persian poetic traditions with artistic techniques learned from craftsmen who had studied in workshops from Baghdad to Beijing. The agricultural innovations that spread throughout the Timurid territories included new irrigation techniques that had been developed in different regions of the former Mongol Empire, creating agricultural productivity that supported urban populations engaged in craft production and international trade. The famous gardens of Samarkand combined practical agriculture with aesthetic principles derived from Persian Chinese and Central Asian traditions, creating landscapes that celebrated both natural beauty and human ingenuity. Yet even as the Timurid Empire reached its cultural zenith, forces were already at work that would gradually undermine the foundations of overland Silk Road trade. The Ottoman Empire's expansion into Anatolia and the Balkans created new political complications for European merchants seeking to participate in Asian trade, while the rising costs of maintaining security along increasingly contested routes made overland commerce less attractive compared to maritime alternatives. The Portuguese voyages around Africa, beginning with Vasco da Gama's expedition to India in 1498, demonstrated that sea routes could bypass the entire overland network while potentially offering lower costs and greater security. This maritime alternative would eventually prove devastating to the traditional Silk Road cities, though that transformation would unfold over centuries rather than decades. The Ming dynasty's adoption of a more isolationist foreign policy following the overthrow of the Mongols represented a fundamental shift in Chinese engagement with the outside world that would have profound implications for Silk Road commerce. While the Ming continued to trade with Central Asian partners, they abandoned the cosmopolitan openness that had characterized Chinese civilization during the Yuan period, preferring to control international contacts through carefully regulated border markets and diplomatic missions. The commercial practices that had developed during the height of Mongol rule continued to influence international trade, even as political circumstances changed, demonstrating the resilience of institutions and relationships that had been forged through centuries of cross-cultural exchange. The credit systems, standardized weights and measures, and dispute resolution mechanisms that had evolved to serve Silk Road commerce provided models that would influence commercial development in other regions and later historical periods. The intellectual legacy of the Mongol period included scientific and philosophical achievements that had been made possible by the unprecedented scale of cultural exchange that Mongol unity had facilitated. The astronomical observations made in Chinese observatories were combined with Islamic mathematical techniques to create more accurate calendars and navigational tools, while medical knowledge from across Eurasia was synthesized into comprehensive healing systems that drew from multiple traditions. The linguistic influences that resulted from centuries of Mongol rule created a shared vocabulary of commercial and administrative terms that facilitated communication across cultural and ethnic boundaries. Persian emerged as the lingua franca of educated discourse across much of Central and South Asia, while Mongolian administrative terminology influenced governmental practices from Russia to Korea. The 15th century arrived like the final movement of a grand symphony as the ancient melodies of Silk Road commerce began their slow transformation into echoes that would resonate through history even as new themes emerged to reshape the destiny of nations and the flow of global trade. The Ottoman Empire, rising from the ashes of Byzantine decline to become the dominant power astride the crossroads between Europe and Asia, assumed control over the western terminus of the Silk Road network at a moment when maritime alternatives were beginning to challenge the supremacy of overland routes that had defined international commerce for over a millennium. Sultan Mehmed II's conquest of Constantinople in 1453 marked not merely the end of the Byzantine Empire, but the beginning of a new chapter in Silk Road history, as Ottoman control over the Bosphorus and the traditional routes through Anatolia created both opportunities and obstacles for European merchants seeking access to Asian luxuries. The Ottomans, inheriting a commercial system that had evolved over centuries, proved themselves capable administrators who understood that their empire's prosperity depended upon facilitating rather than hindering international trade. Under Ottoman rule, the great trading cities of the Eastern Mediterranean experienced a revival that recalled the prosperity of earlier eras, as Istanbul became a magnificent entrepot where goods from China, India, and Central Asia were distributed to European customers willing to pay premium prices for exotic luxuries. The Grand Bazaar of Istanbul, with its thousands of shops and its labyrinthine passages, became a microcosm of the entire Silk Road network, bringing together merchants from every corner of the known world in a celebration of commercial diversity that had few equals in human history. Yet even as the Ottoman Empire reached its zenith under rulers like Suleiman the Magnificent, forces were gathering that would fundamentally alter the balance between land and sea routes in international commerce. The Portuguese, having perfected the techniques of deep ocean navigation that allowed them to round the Cape of Good Hope and reach the Indian Ocean, directly began to demonstrate that maritime routes could offer significant advantages over traditional overland pathways. Vasco da Gama's arrival in Calicut in 1498 represented a watershed moment in the history of global trade, as European merchants gained direct access to Asian markets without having to traverse the costly and dangerous overland routes that had enriched Central Asian intermediaries for centuries. The Portuguese Estado da India, though initially limited in scope, demonstrated the potential for European maritime empires to bypass the traditional Silk Road network entirely, while potentially offering lower costs and greater security for long-distance commerce. The Spanish discovery of the Americas and the establishment of the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade created an entirely new axis of global commerce that connected Asian luxury goods with American silver in a trans-Pacific exchange that competed directly with traditional Silk Road routes. Chinese silk and porcelain, along with other Asian goods, now flowed eastward across the Pacific to Mexico and from there to Europe, creating alternative pathways that reduced dependence on Central Asian routes. The rise of European joint stock companies, the Dutch East India Company, the English East India Company, and their competitors brought unprecedented capital resources and organizational efficiency to maritime trade in Asian goods. These commercial enterprises, backed by state power and equipped with the latest military technology, could offer services that traditional Silk Road merchants found increasingly difficult to match in terms of cost security and reliability. The Safavid Empire in Persia, under rulers like Shah Abbas I, attempted to revitalize overland trade routes by improving infrastructure and offering favorable conditions to international merchants. Yet even their best efforts could not fully compensate for the structural advantages that maritime routes were beginning to demonstrate. The magnificent city of Isfahan, rebuilt as a showcase of Safavid power and commercial prosperity, represented perhaps the last great flowering of traditional Silk Road urbanism. The Mughal Empire in India, controlling vast territories and enormous wealth, became increasingly oriented toward maritime commerce as European trading companies established permanent bases along the Indian coastline. While overland routes through Central Asia continued to carry some trade between India and China, the volume and value of this commerce gradually declined as sea routes proved more efficient for bulk commodities and high-value goods alike. The technological revolution that was transforming European military and naval capabilities during this period included innovations that had originally spread westward along the Silk Road, but were now being refined and improved in European workshops and arsenals. Gunpowder weapons, printing technology, navigational instruments, and metallurgical techniques that had originated in China or been perfected in Islamic lands were being adapted to serve European expansion into previously inaccessible markets. The Qing dynasty's conquest of China in 1644 brought to power rulers who maintained an ambivalent relationship with international trade, alternately encouraging and restricting foreign commerce according to their assessment of its impact on Chinese security and social stability. While the Qing continued to trade with Central Asian partners and welcomed some European merchants, their policies lacked the consistent support for international commerce that had characterized earlier Chinese dynasties. The Russian expansion into Siberia and Central Asia during this period created new political complications for traditional Silk Road routes, as Russian fur traders and military expeditions gradually extended Moscow's influence into territories that had been dominated by Mongol and Turkic peoples for centuries. The establishment of Russian trading posts and military fortifications altered the political balance in Central Asia, while creating alternative routes for some categories of trade. The gradual decline of the great Central Asian trading cities during the 16th and 17th centuries reflected the cumulative impact of changing trade patterns, political instability, and competition from maritime routes. Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar, which had been among the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan cities in the world, began to lose their international character as the volume of transcontinental commerce flowing through their markets decreased. The cultural and intellectual isolation that accompanied the decline of overland trade routes had profound implications for the societies that had flourished as intermediaries in Silk Road commerce. The cosmopolitan traditions that had developed over centuries of cultural exchange gradually gave way to more parochial perspectives as reduced commercial contact limited opportunities for learning from foreign traditions and technologies. The artistic traditions that had been nourished by Silk Road cultural exchange began to lose their international character as patron communities became more isolated and as the flow of foreign influences diminished. While local traditions continued to develop according to their own internal logic, the The synthesis of diverse cultural elements that had characterized Silk Road art gradually became less common and less sophisticated. The scientific and technological stagnation that affected many Central Asian societies during this period reflected the reduced participation in the international exchange of ideas and innovations that had driven human progress for centuries, while European societies were experiencing the scientific revolution, partly through their access to Chinese and Islamic knowledge via maritime routes. The traditional Silk Road regions found themselves increasingly cut off from the cutting edge of human knowledge. The linguistic changes that occurred during this period included the gradual decline of Persian as the lingua franca of international commerce and diplomacy across Central Asia, as reduced trade volumes and political fragmentation limited the practical value of maintaining proficiency in languages that had once been essential for commercial success. Local languages and dialects began to reassert their dominance as international communication became less frequent and less necessary. Yet even as the traditional overland Silk Road entered its final phase, the legacy of over 15 centuries of transcontinental commerce continued to influence human civilization in ways that would extend far beyond the commercial networks that had originally created them. The techniques of international trade, the legal frameworks for cross-cultural commerce, and the diplomatic protocols for managing relationships between diverse societies had been refined through Silk Road experience and would continue to influence international relations in the emerging world system. The 17th and 18th centuries witnessed the final transformation of the ancient Silk Road from a living network of commerce and cultural exchange into a constellation of memories and monuments that would forever commemorate humanity's greatest experiment in transcontinental cooperation. Yet, even as the last great caravans made their way across the deserts and mountains that had witnessed the passage of countless generations of merchants, pilgrims, and adventurers, the spirit of the Silk Road was already being reborn in new forms that would carry its essential message into the modern age. The British East India Company's expansion into India and the establishment of the Raj represented the culmination of European maritime dominance over Asian trade, as the company's private armies and commercial networks gradually displaced the last remnants of traditional overland commerce. The great port cities of Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras became the new entrepôts, where Asian goods were gathered for shipment to European markets, replacing the ancient trading centers of Central Asia in the global commercial hierarchy. The Russian Empire's inexorable expansion southward and eastward brought Slavic settlement to regions that had been dominated by Turkic and Mongol peoples for centuries, fundamentally altering the demographic and political landscape of Central Asia. The construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway in the late 19th century would eventually create a new form of transcontinental connection, but one that served Russian imperial interests, rather than the diverse commercial networks that had characterized the traditional Silk Road. The Chinese Empire, under the Qing dynasty, maintained its vast territorial extent, while pursuing policies that increasingly isolated the Middle Kingdom from the international exchanges that had enriched Chinese civilization during earlier periods. The famous Macartney Embassy of 1793, Britain's attempt to establish formal diplomatic and commercial relations with China, demonstrated both the persistence of European interest in Chinese markets and the growing divergence between Chinese and European approaches to international commerce. The Industrial Revolution that transformed European societies during the 18th and 19th centuries was built upon technologies and knowledge that had originally traveled westward along the Silk Road, yet the new manufacturing capabilities that emerged from this industrial transformation would eventually make many traditional Silk Road goods obsolete or uncompetitive. Machine-produced textiles replaced hand-woven silks, while synthetic dyes eliminated the demand for many traditional plant and mineral colorants that had sustained Central Asian commerce for centuries. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 represented the final triumph of maritime routes over overland alternatives, as European merchants could now reach Asian markets more quickly and cheaply by sea than their predecessors had ever been able to achieve using traditional caravan routes. The great trading cities of Central Asia, already marginalized by centuries of declining commerce, found themselves completely bypassed by the new technologies and commercial arrangements that define the modern world economy. Yet even as the physical infrastructure of the Silk Road fell into disrepair, and its cities lost their international significance, the cultural and intellectual legacy of 15 centuries of transcontinental exchange continued to shape human civilization in ways both obvious and subtle. The Islamic Golden Age, the European Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, and the Enlightenment had all been nourished by knowledge and techniques that had traveled along Silk Road networks, creating intellectual traditions that would influence human thought for centuries to come. The archaeological rediscovery of the Silk Road during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, through the expeditions of explorers like Aurel Stein, Sven Hedin, and Paul Pelliot, revealed to the modern world the magnificent civilizations that had flourished in the deserts and oases of Central Asia. The manuscripts discovered in the sealed library cave at Dunhuang, the Buddhist frescoes uncovered in the caves of the Bezeklik complex, and the Greco-Buddhist sculptures found in Gandhara demonstrated the extraordinary cultural synthesis that had been achieved through centuries of Silk Road exchange. The emergence of modern nationalism during the 19th and 20th centuries created new political boundaries that fragmented the cultural unity that had characterized Silk Road civilizations, yet the shared heritage of transcontinental exchange continued to influence art, literature, and philosophy across the regions that had participated in the ancient network. Persian poetry, Chinese landscape painting, Islamic architecture, and Buddhist sculpture all bore the marks of cross-cultural fertilization that had occurred through centuries of commercial and cultural contact. The two world wars of the 20th century and the subsequent Cold War created new barriers to international exchange that would have been incomprehensible to the merchants and pilgrims who had created the Silk Road. Yet the fundamental human impulse toward connection and cooperation that had motivated the ancient network continued to manifest itself in new forms. The United Nations international law, global communications networks, and multinational corporations all reflected the same basic recognition that human prosperity and progress depended upon transcending local boundaries and creating systems for peaceful cooperation across cultural and political differences. The establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949 and the subsequent opening of China to international trade in the late 20th century created new possibilities for transcontinental commerce that recalled the golden age of Tang Dynasty engagement with the outside world. The modern development of trade routes connecting China with Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe represented a conscious attempt to revive the Silk Road's legacy while adapting its principles to contemporary conditions. The Belt and Road Initiative launched by China in the 21st century explicitly invoked the memory of the ancient Silk Road, while proposing to create new infrastructure and commercial networks that would connect Asia, Africa, and Europe in mutually beneficial relationships. This modern revival of Silk Road ideals demonstrated the continuing relevance of the principles that had guided transcontinental commerce for over a millennium. The recognition that prosperity comes through cooperation rather than conflict, that diversity strengthens rather than weakens human civilization, and that the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures enriches all participants. The digital revolution that has transformed human communication and commerce in recent decades has created possibilities for instant connection across vast distances that would have seemed miraculous to ancient Silk Road merchants. Yet the fundamental challenges of building trust, managing cultural differences, and creating mutually beneficial relationships across diverse societies remain remarkably similar to those faced by the pioneers who first carved the ancient trade routes. The environmental challenges that face the modern world, climate change, resource depletion, and ecological degradation require the same kind of international cooperation and shared responsibility that characterized the Silk Road at its best. The recognition that local actions have global consequences and that sustainable prosperity requires thinking beyond immediate self-interest reflects the same wisdom that enabled ancient merchants to create and maintain commercial networks that spanned continents and lasted for centuries. The cultural renaissance that is occurring in many former Silk Road regions reflects a growing appreciation for the cosmopolitan traditions that had flourished during the height of transcontinental exchange. The restoration of historic monuments, the revival of traditional crafts, and the celebration of cultural diversity in cities like Istanbul, Samarkand, and Xi'an demonstrate the enduring appeal of the Silk Road's multicultural legacy. As humanity faces the challenges and opportunities of an increasingly interconnected world, the lessons of the Silk Road remain as relevant today as they were 15 centuries ago, when Zhang Qian first set foot on the path that would connect East and West in an embrace that has never been broken. The ancient roads may have fallen silent, their caravanserais may stand empty, and their cities may have lost their international prominence, yet the spirit of the Silk Road lives on in every act of peaceful cooperation between peoples of different cultures, every exchange of knowledge that advances human understanding, and every recognition that our shared humanity transcends the boundaries that seem to divide us. The Silk Road's greatest legacy lies not in the goods that traveled its routes or the wealth that flowed through its cities, but in its demonstration that human beings can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles when they are united by common purposes and guided by mutual respect. In an age when the entire world has become a single interconnected system, the wisdom of the Silk Road, that prosperity comes through cooperation, that diversity is strength, and that the highest human achievements emerge from the meeting of different traditions, remains our most precious inheritance from the merchants, pilgrims, and visionaries who dared to dream of connecting the ends of the earth in bonds of friendship and mutual benefit. Thus ends the great saga of the Silk Road, not with an ending, but with a beginning, as each new generation rediscovers the eternal truth that the ancient network embodied that human beings are meant to be connected, that our differences make us stronger rather than weaker, and that the roads we build together will always be more enduring than the walls we build apart.